The Mediterranean sun of 1429 rose over an island that few in Europe considered worth dying for. Yet on this particular morning in late summer, the fate of Malta hung by a thread so fine that a single gust of wind might have severed it entirely, casting the rocky outcrop into an abyss from which no recovery would have been possible. The island, barely 27 kilometres at its widest point, sat like a stepping stone between Sicily and the North African coast, a position that had made it valuable to every power that had ever sought to control the sea lanes between east and west, north and south, Christian and Muslim, trader and pirate, conqueror and conquered. What made this particular siege so remarkable was not the clash of professional armies or the deployment of cutting-edge military technology, though both would play their parts, but rather the almost absurd disparity between the forces involved and the outcome that no rational military mind of the age could have predicted. 800 souls, most of them farmers who had never held a sword in anger, who knew more about the optimal time to plant barley than the proper way to rappel scaling ladders, stood against 18,000 battle-hardened warriors who had crossed the Mediterranean with the express purpose of adding this limestone fortress to an empire that stretched from the Atlantic shores of Morocco to the gates of Constantinople itself. The Hafsid Sultanate, ruling from Tunis, had by 1429 consolidated its power over much of the Maghreb, that vast stretch of North Africa that medieval Europeans called Barbary, a corruption of Berber that carried with it all the fear and fascination that Christendom held for the Islamic kingdoms across the narrow sea. Sultan Abu Faris Abd al-Aziz al-Mutawakkil, a name that rolled off Arabic tongues with the rhythm of poetry but stumbled awkwardly in Latin chronicles, had ascended to power with ambitions that exceeded the considerable territorial inheritance his predecessors had assembled. He looked across the water at Malta with eyes that saw not the struggling community of fishermen and subsistence farmers that it actually housed, but rather a permanent base from which his fleets could strike at Sicily, perhaps even at the Italian mainland itself, disrupting the maritime trade that enriched Venice and Genoa, while strengthening the hand of Islam in its perpetual contest with Christianity for Mediterranean supremacy. The decision to invade Malta had been made during the winter months, in the cushioned halls of the palace at Tunis, where advisors had drawn maps on vellum and calculated ratios of soldiers to defenders, siege engines to fortifications, ships to harbours, all with the confidence of men who had never personally felt the uncertainty of battle or smelled the particular stench of death under a hot sun. The mathematical certainty of the invasion's success had been assured by every military theorist the Sultan consulted, for the Hafsid armies had recently demonstrated their prowess in multiple campaigns along the North African coast, and the intelligence reports from Malta suggested that the island's defences consisted of little more than a single fortified town and scattered watchtowers manned by militiamen who drilled perhaps once a month if weather permitted. What these advisors failed to account for, what perhaps no amount of theoretical military science could have predicted, was the particular quality of desperation that takes hold of people when they understand with perfect clarity that surrender means not merely the change of one master for another, but the complete erasure of their way of life, their faith, their families, their very existence as they understood it. The Maltese of 1429 were not naive about what awaited them if the Hafsid forces prevailed. They had heard the stories from other islands and coastal towns that had fallen to Muslim raiders, tales of populations enslaved wholesale, of churches converted to mosques, of children taken to be raised in a foreign faith, of women distributed among the victorious soldiers as spoils of war. The island's nominal ruler, Don Gonsalvo Monroy, served as lieutenant to the King of Aragon, who held Malta as a distant appendage of his sprawling Mediterranean empire, valuable primarily as a naval way station and a source of modest taxation. Monroy himself was a veteran of the endless small wars that characterized Iberian politics in the early 15th century, a man who had killed his first enemy at 16 during a border skirmish between Castilian factions, and who carried the scars of at least a dozen wounds across his torso and limbs like a map of his violent career. He was not a great general in the mould of Caesar or Alexander, not a man whose name would echo through the centuries in military academies, but he possessed something perhaps more valuable in the desperate situation Malta faced. He understood fundamentally that rules of warfare existed to be broken when survival itself hung in the balance. When the first reports reached Malta in late July that a massive fleet had departed from Tunis, heading northwest toward the island, Monroy conducted a census of his available forces that yielded numbers so dismally inadequate that a lesser man might have immediately sued for terms or fled to Sicily on the fastest ship available. The garrison of professional soldiers numbered exactly 43 men, most of them Catalans or Aragonese, who had been posted to Malta as punishment for various infractions or as a stepping stone to more prestigious assignments elsewhere in the king's domains. These were not the elite troops that guarded the palaces of Barcelona or the frontiers facing Granada, but rather the dregs of the military establishment, men who drank too much or gambled away their pay or had offended superior officers in ways that demanded exile without quite justifying execution. Beyond this underwhelming professional corps, Monroy could call upon approximately 200 militiamen who had some modicum of military training, mostly the sons of the island's minor nobility and more prosperous merchants who were expected to maintain arms and armour and to appear for periodic musters. These men varied wildly in quality. Some had participated in minor naval actions against pirates, or had served briefly in Sicily or Italy, while others had never experienced combat beyond the occasional tavern brawl, and treated their militia service as a tedious social obligation to be endured with minimal effort. The remaining 557 defenders, when Monroy completed his tally, consisted of whoever could be pressed into service from the general population. Farmers whose hands were calloused from plough handles rather than sword grips. Fishermen who knew the sea but not how to defend against those who crossed it with violent intent. Craftsmen whose expertise lay in carpentry or masonry or weaving, rather than in the arts of war. Even boys as young as 12 or 13 who might serve as runners or supply haulers if nothing else. This motley assembly represented not an army in any conventional sense, but simply the total adult male population of the fortified town of Mdina and the immediate surrounding territory that might reach the safety of the walls before the invaders arrived. Mdina itself, perched on a plateau in the centre of the island, was an ancient foundation, its origins stretching back beyond living memory to the Phoenicians and Romans, who had recognised the strategic value of this elevated position. The walls that surrounded the city were medieval additions, constructed over the previous 2 centuries with varying degrees of skill and maintenance, presenting a circuit of roughly 800 metres of limestone fortifications that range from impressively solid to worryingly decrepit depending on which section one inspected. The highest point of the walls stood perhaps 12 metres above the surrounding plateau, offering defenders a clear field of fire across the approaches, but also presenting numerous weak points where the masonry had crumbled, or where medieval builders had economised on materials in ways that contemporary observers could now recognise as dangerously inadequate. The city's water supply depended on a complex system of cisterns carved deep into the limestone bedrock, a technology inherited from the island's Roman past and maintained through generations by local stonemasons who understood the precious nature of fresh water on an island where streams ran dry for months at a time. These cisterns, at least, represented a genuine strategic advantage, for they could sustain the population through a siege of considerable duration, provided that disease did not contaminate them or that a lucky enemy shot did not breach their chambers. Food presented a more complicated challenge. The harvest season had not yet arrived when word of the approaching fleet reached Malta, meaning that the grain stores consisted only of what remained from the previous year, already depleted by normal consumption. Monroy ordered the immediate requisition of all available foodstuffs from the surrounding countryside, sending out parties of militiamen to sweep through every village and farmstead, gathering sacks of grain, barrels of salted fish, wheels of cheese, preserved olives, dried figs, anything that could sustain a body through the coming ordeal. The farmers who surrendered their provisions did so with varying degrees of cooperation. Some understood that their supplies would be worthless if the island fell, and they found themselves in chains, while others bitterly protested what they saw as theft by their own government, unable or unwilling to grasp the magnitude of the approaching threat. The Hafsid fleet that bore down on Malta consisted of 137 vessels of various sizes, from massive transport ships capable of carrying hundreds of soldiers to swift galleys designed for naval combat to smaller craft meant for landing operations in shallow water. The sight of this armada as it appeared on the horizon must have been terrifying beyond measure to the Maltese watchers posted on the island's southern coast. A forest of masts and sails that seemed to cover the sea from horizon to horizon. The largest hostile force that Malta had witnessed in living memory, perhaps the largest in its entire recorded history. The man commanding this overwhelming force was not the Sultan himself, but rather his most trusted military commander, a veteran named Ahmad ibn Uthman, whose career had encompassed dozens of campaigns across the Maghreb, and who enjoyed a fearsome reputation among both his own soldiers and the enemies he had defeated. Ibn Uthman was a professional warrior in an age when professionalism in military affairs was less common than history sometimes suggests. He had studied the classical texts of warfare, could quote from Vegetius and the Byzantine military manuals, understood siegecraft not as a collection of traditional practices, but as an evolving science that combined engineering, logistics, psychology, and raw violence in carefully calculated proportions. The landing of 18,000 men on an island the size of Malta represented a logistical challenge of the first order, even when those men faced minimal opposition. Ibn Uthman chose the southeastern coast for his main landing, selecting a series of beaches and coves where his fleet could discharge soldiers and equipment while remaining relatively protected from the prevailing winds. The operation proceeded across 3 days in early August, with vessels approaching the shore in carefully orchestrated waves, their occupants wading through the surf carrying weapons and supplies, establishing a beachhead that expanded steadily inland as more and more soldiers arrived. The Maltese defenders, vastly outnumbered and lacking any capacity for meaningful resistance to such a landing, could do nothing but watch from distant hillsides as the invasion unfolded. Monroy had forbidden any attempt to contest the beaches, recognizing that his tiny force would be swept aside in moments if it ventured out from behind Medina's walls to challenge the invaders in open combat. This restraint, this willingness to surrender the countryside without a fight, required an iron discipline that was not natural to the more hot-blooded among the defenders, some of whom muttered about cowardice and defeatism, even as they reluctantly obeyed orders to remain within the city. Once ashore, the Hafsid forces moved with the practiced efficiency of a professional army that had executed similar operations many times before. Camp followers, thousands of them, spread across the landscape to forage and to establish the supply networks that would sustain such a large force on an island that had barely enough resources to feed its own population. The invaders drove off livestock, stripped orchards, trampled grain fields and demolished farmsteads, carrying off anything useful and destroying what they could not take. This devastation was not merely wanton cruelty but deliberate strategy. By consuming or destroying the island's agricultural resources, Ibn Uthman ensured that the defenders could receive no supplies from the countryside, and that any prolonged resistance would rely entirely on whatever provisions had been stockpiled within Medina's walls before the siege began. The Hafsid army's ethnic composition reflected the complex nature of North African society in the 15th century, where Arab, Berber, and even sub-Saharan African warriors served alongside each other in a military establishment that prized martial skill and religious devotion over narrow ethnic loyalty. The cavalry, perhaps 2,000 strong, consisted primarily of Arab and Berber horsemen whose families had practiced mounted warfare for generations, riders who seemed to merge with their animals in a way that European knights, encumbered by heavier armour and different tactical traditions, often found difficult to counter. The infantry, forming the bulk of the force, ranged from heavily armoured veterans who had fought in multiple campaigns to lightly equipped skirmishers drawn from the Atlas mountain tribes, men for whom warfare was as natural as breathing, and who regarded combat as both livelihood and sacred duty. Among the invaders marched perhaps 1,000 men who might be classified as engineers and specialists, individuals whose knowledge of siege warfare, of mining and counter-mining, of constructing siege engines and operating artillery, of building assault towers and undermining walls, represented the accumulated military science of Islamic civilization at its medieval apex. These men carried with them not only tools and equipment, but also manuscripts and manuals, technical literature that described in painstaking detail the methods by which fortified positions could be reduced through the systematic application of violence and engineering. The Hafsid artillery train included several large cannon, massive weapons that required teams of oxen to move, and that could hurl stone projectiles weighing 100 pounds or more across hundreds of meters. These guns represented cutting-edge military technology, and 1429 for gunpowder weapons had only recently evolved from curiosities into genuinely effective siege tools, and the techniques for casting, transporting, and operating them remained mysteries known to relatively few specialists. The Sultan had invested heavily in acquiring both the weapons themselves and the expertise to use them effectively, recognizing that cities which could resist traditional siege methods for months might crumble in weeks or days when subjected to sustained bombardment by heavy artillery. By the second week of August, the Hafsid forces had completed their landing operations and established a series of fortified camps surrounding Medina, at distances ranging from 1 to 3 kilometers from the walls, close enough to maintain effective siege operations but far enough to remain relatively safe from defensive artillery fire. Ibn Uthman positioned his camps with care, ensuring that no relief force could approach the city from any direction without first engaging his army, effectively isolating the defenders from any possibility of external assistance. Not that such assistance appeared likely. The nearest Aragonese forces of any size were in Sicily, and the Sicilian authorities, preoccupied with their own political complexities and border threats, showed little enthusiasm for launching a risky naval expedition to relieve a distant island outpost of questionable strategic value. Inside Medina, the mood oscillated between grim determination and barely suppressed panic as the reality of the siege settled over the population like a suffocating blanket. Monroy established strict rationing immediately, calculating that the available food might sustain the defenders for perhaps 3 months if consumption was carefully controlled, longer if the civilian population could be persuaded to accept genuine hunger rather than merely reduced portions. He organised the 800 defenders into rotating watches, ensuring that the walls remained manned at all hours, while also allowing men to rest and recover between their shifts. Sleep, always precious in wartime, became a tactical resource to be allocated as carefully as gunpowder or arrows. The social composition of the besieged population created tensions that Monroy struggled to manage without the luxury of time or resources that such delicate negotiations normally required. The merchant families who dominated Medina's civic life before the siege considered themselves a class apart from the farmers and labourers who now shared their cramped quarters within the walls, and they resisted the complete levelling of social hierarchies that effective defence seemed to require. Meanwhile, the soldiers from Aragon and Catalonia regarded the local Maltese with a mixture of condescension and suspicion, seeing them as provincial rustics whose loyalty to a distant king they had never seen might prove less reliable than their desire to survive by whatever means necessary. Religious life, which in peacetime provided structure and meaning to existence for virtually everyone in medieval Christian society, took on an intensity during the siege that approached fanaticism in some quarters while provoking cynical rejection in others. The Bishop of Malta, a political appointee who had spent most of his tenure concerned with collecting tithes and adjudicating property disputes, suddenly found himself thrust into the role of spiritual warrior, expected to provide divine justification for resistance, and to assure terrified parishioners that God would not permit the faithful to fall into Muslim hands. He rose to this challenge with sermons that combined genuine piety with theatrical manipulation, invoking the most lurid martyrdom narratives from Christian history, while promising that angels themselves would defend the walls if the defenders maintained faith and courage. The first Hafsid assault came on August 18th, a probing attack designed more to test the defences than to achieve a genuine breach. Ibn Uthman sent forward perhaps 1,000 infantrymen, carrying scaling ladders and fascinels to fill the defensive ditches, supported by archers who peppered the walls with arrows intended to force the defenders to keep their heads down, while the assault troops approached. The Maltese response revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their position. The defenders fought with desperate courage, born of knowing that retreat meant doom, but they lacked the coordination and discipline of professional soldiers, wasting arrows on targets beyond effective range and clustering in some areas while leaving others dangerously undermanned. Monroy, watching from a tower, recognised immediately that his force could not sustain the kind of conventional defence that military manuals prescribed, where soldiers stood in neat ranks and repelled attackers through disciplined application of arms. Instead, he began developing tactics that exploited the defenders' few advantages. intimate knowledge of every stone and passageway in their own city, willingness to take risks that professional soldiers might refuse, and the desperate creativity that emerges when conventional methods offer no hope of success. He ordered the construction of hidden sally ports, through which small groups of defenders could emerge to attack besiegers at unexpected moments, then retreat before superior numbers could respond. He positioned civilians, including women and children, at protected spots where they could hurl rocks and boiling water on attackers, while armed men concentrated at the most threatened points. The siege engines that the Hafsid forces constructed over the following weeks represented the culmination of centuries of military engineering development in the Islamic world. Massive trebuchets, each requiring teams of craftsmen days to assemble, began hurling projectiles against Medina's walls with devastating effect. The limestone construction that had seemed so solid to the defenders revealed its vulnerabilities under sustained bombardment. Sections of wall that had stood for centuries cracked and crumbled under the impact of stones weighing hundreds of pounds, each strike sending fragments flying and shaking the ground like miniature earthquakes. The Hafsid cannons, once properly positioned and supplied with powder and shot, added their terrible voices to the bombardment. The roar of these weapons terrified defenders who had never experienced anything like the sound or the shocking destructive power of the projectiles they launched. Medieval fortifications had evolved over centuries to resist battering rams and catapults and mining operations, but the science of building walls to withstand artillery remained in its infancy in 1429, and Medina's fortifications had not been designed with gunpowder weapons in mind at all. When a cannonball struck a section of wall, it did not merely chip away at the surface, but could punch completely through the masonry, sending deadly fragments of stone ricocheting in all directions and creating breaches that required immediate repair under fire. The defenders' counter-battery fire came from a motley collection of weapons that made the Hafsid artillery train look like a showcase of modern military technology by comparison. Medina possessed exactly 4 small cannon, none of them particularly reliable, all of them prone to misfiring or even exploding if loaded incorrectly. The Maltese gunners, more familiar with fishing nets than with powder charges and projectile trajectories, learned their deadly craft through trial and error, with several men dying when a gun burst during firing, its metal unable to withstand the forces it was designed to contain. The defenders supplemented these inadequate firearms with traditional siege weapons, crossbows that could strike down individual attackers at impressive ranges, mangonels that hurled stones in high arcs to crash down on besiegers, cauldrons of quicklime that could be dumped on anyone attempting to scale the walls. As August gave way to September, the siege settled into a rhythm of bombardment and assault, repair and counter-assault, a grinding contest of endurance that favoured the attackers in every measurable category except one. The defenders had nowhere else to go. Ibn Uthman could afford to be patient, rotating fresh troops into the front lines while others rested, maintaining supply lines back to his fleet and thence to North Africa, conducting the siege according to the timeless principles that dictated such operations. He calculated that the defenders' food would run out, or their ammunition would be exhausted, or their walls would crumble sufficiently to permit a successful assault, all long before his own forces reached their breaking point. What Ibn Uthman failed to appreciate fully, what perhaps no outsider could have understood without living it themselves, was the transformation that siege warfare worked upon the defenders of Medina. The farmers who had initially fumbled with unfamiliar weapons became, through sheer repetition and desperate necessity, remarkably effective fighters. The social divisions that had seemed so important in peacetime eroded under the equalizing experience of shared danger. A nobleman's son and a fisherman's boy who fought side by side night after night, who pulled each other from beneath collapsing masonry and shared their meagre food rations, developed bonds that transcended the class structures they had known all their lives. Monroy, meanwhile, revealed gifts for psychological warfare that his conventional military service had never required or developed. He understood that the siege was as much a battle of wills as a contest of arms, and he set about systematically undermining the enemy's confidence while maintaining his own forces' cohesion. When the defenders killed prominent enemy soldiers during assaults, Monroy ensured that their bodies were displayed prominently on the walls with signs mocking the invaders' martial prowess. When Hafsid deserters occasionally made their way to the city, driven by hunger or disillusionment, Monroy treated them well publicly, while extracting every scrap of useful intelligence about the besiegers' plans and morale. The deserters revealed that all was not well within the Hafsid camp despite its overwhelming numerical superiority. The logistics of maintaining 18,000 men on an island with limited resources proved more challenging than the invasion planners had anticipated. Foraging parties had stripped the countryside bare within the first month, forcing the army to rely increasingly on supplies shipped from North Africa, and the autumn storm season was approaching when the Mediterranean became dangerous for navigation. Disease had begun to appear in the camps, the inevitable consequence of so many men living in close quarters, with inadequate sanitation and the daily casualty lists from assault operations, while modest by the standards of major battles, accumulated steadily into numbers that began to trouble even hardened veterans. The Maltese defenders, by contrast, suffered fewer losses from disease despite their more crowded conditions within the city walls, possibly because they had developed immunity to local pathogens over lifetimes of exposure, whereas the invaders brought with them North African diseases while encountering Maltese ones. The defenders' casualties from combat, while painful in absolute terms given their small numbers, remained sustainable because Monroy refused to commit his forces to operations where loss rates would prove catastrophic. Every defender who fell represented a significant percentage of the total force, whereas Ibn Uthman could lose 100 men in a single assault and barely notice the reduction in his order of battle. By mid-September, the bombardment had created several significant breaches in Mdina's walls, gaps wide enough that determined attackers could force their way through if they were willing to accept the casualties that such an assault would entail. Ibn Uthman, seeing what he believed to be the beginning of the end, ordered a major assault for September 20th, committing 5,000 men in a coordinated attack against 3 separate points in the defences. The plan, sound in conception, and executed with professional competence, assumed that the defenders lacked the numbers to adequately man multiple threatened points simultaneously, and that at least one assault column would achieve a breakthrough that could then be exploited to collapse the entire defence. The attack began at dawn with a massive bombardment intended to force the defenders away from the walls, followed immediately by the assault columns surging forward with scaling ladders and through the breached sections. The Hafsid soldiers advanced with the confidence of men who had executed similar operations many times before, who understood that the defenders before them were farmers and fishermen playing at being soldiers, who believed that courage and desperation could only achieve so much against superior numbers and professional skill. What they encountered instead was a defence that had learned from 2 months of nearly continuous combat, that had evolved tactics specifically suited to their desperate circumstances. The breaches in the walls, rather than representing fatal weaknesses, had been converted into killing zones, where the Maltese concentrated their most effective weapons and their best fighters. Monroy had ordered the construction of internal barriers behind each breach, creating secondary defensive lines that would channel attackers into narrow passages where numbers meant little and where every step forward cost blood. The defenders had stockpiled huge quantities of stones, lumber, boiling oil, quicklime, anything that could be dropped or thrown or poured onto attackers struggling through the breaches. The assault columns pressed forward with admirable determination, fighting their way into the breaches despite horrific casualties. But the internal defences that Monroy had prepared stopped them short of achieving any significant penetration into the city itself. Hours of savage close-quarters combat saw the Hafsid soldiers advance and retreat repeatedly, gaining ground only to be driven back by desperate counterattacks, the fight degenerating into the kind of chaotic melee where organisation and discipline counted for less than raw ferocity and willingness to die rather than yield a single step. By mid-afternoon, with the assault clearly stalled and casualties mounting into the hundreds, Ibn Uthman ordered a withdrawal, pulling his battered assault columns back to their camps to regroup and tend to their wounded. The September 20th attack, which should have overwhelmed the defence through sheer numerical superiority, had instead demonstrated that the Maltese would not collapse easily, that taking Mdina would require a level of effort and sacrifice beyond what the planners in Tunis had imagined when they conceived this invasion. The psychological impact of this failed assault resonated through both armies in ways that statistics alone could not capture. The defenders, who had faced their moment of greatest trial and survived, felt a surge of confidence that transformed their mindset from merely hoping to hold out until relief arrived to believing that they might actually defeat the besiegers outright. The attackers, conversely, began to question whether the prize was worth the cost, whether the conquest of a small island with minimal economic value justified the continued expenditure of lives and resources. October brought with it the first serious storms of the autumn season, Mediterranean tempests that transformed the sea from the besiegers' highway for reinforcement and supply into a dangerous barrier that isolated the Hafsid army on Malta as thoroughly as the defenders were isolated within Medina. Ships attempting to cross from North Africa faced genuine peril, and several vessels were lost with all hands when they ventured out despite dangerous conditions. The supply situation within the Hafsid camps, already strained, began to deteriorate seriously as the intervals between resupply convoys lengthened from days to weeks. Inside the city, the food situation had become genuinely desperate by this point. The strict rationing that Monroy had implemented at the siege's beginning had stretched the available supplies beyond initial projections, but there was no disguising the reality that granaries and storehouses were approaching empty. The defenders subsisted on portions that would have seemed cruel starvation rations in peacetime, a few ounces of grain per day, supplemented by whatever could be scrounged or improvised, with priority given to those actually manning the walls, while civilians, particularly children and the elderly, received even less. Hunger does peculiar things to human psychology, and Monroy watched his command carefully for signs that desperation might tip over into despair or mutiny. He shared the reduced rations himself, ensuring that everyone could see that rank brought no privilege in this fundamental aspect of existence, and he made a point of walking the walls daily despite the danger from enemy missiles, speaking with individual defenders, learning their names and their family stories, transforming them from anonymous soldiers into individuals whose survival mattered personally to their commander. The psychological warfare intensified as both sides recognised that the siege had become as much a test of wills as a military contest. Ibn Uthman ordered his men to parade captured livestock within sight of the walls, roasting meat where the smell would carry to the starving defenders, ostentatiously displaying the relative plenty that the besiegers still enjoyed. Monroy countered by having his men sing and celebrate loudly whenever enemy assaults were repulsed, creating the impression of defenders so confident and well supplied that they could afford to treat warfare as entertainment. In early November, a Hafsid mining operation nearly achieved what direct assaults had failed to accomplish. Engineers had been quietly tunnelling beneath a section of wall for weeks, propping up their mine shaft with wooden supports, while excavating the limestone substrate upon which the fortifications rested. The plan called for filling the completed mine with combustible materials, then setting it ablaze to burn away the wooden supports, causing the tunnel to collapse and bringing down the wall section above it. This technique, ancient and well proven, had breached countless fortifications over the centuries, and the Hafsid engineers executed their work with professional competence. What saved the defenders was not military brilliance, but rather the random good fortune that so often determines the outcomes of sieges. A Maltese woman drawing water from a cistern noticed that the water level had inexplicably dropped and reported this anomaly to the guards, who summoned Monroy to investigate. The commander, whose experience included several sieges where mining had played crucial roles, immediately recognised the potential explanation and ordered countermining operations to begin at once. The defenders, working with desperate speed and guided by the sound of enemy digging transmitted through the stone, excavated their own tunnel and managed to break into the Hafsid mine shaft just hours before the enemy planned to fire it. The vicious underground combat that followed bore no resemblance to the romanticised warfare of chronicles and songs. Men fought and died in cramped darkness, stabbing and clubbing each other in passages barely wide enough to move, breathing air thick with dust and the stench of death. The defenders, fighting for their homes literally above their heads, battled with particular savagery, ultimately managing to drive the Hafsid miners out and collapse the enemy tunnel before it could achieve its purpose. This small victory, unknown to the vast majority of people in either camp, may have done more to preserve the defence than any of the more visible battles fought on the walls. By late November, Ibn Uthman faced a decision that would define his career and possibly his life: continue the siege into winter with increasingly dubious prospects of success, or withdraw and admit that 800 peasants had defeated the professional army of one of the Mediterranean's great powers. The strategic calculations that had made the invasion seem so attractive in the planning stages now appeared far more questionable in the harsh light of actual experience. Malta remained as potentially useful as ever, but the cost of its conquest had already exceeded projections, and continuing the siege through winter meant maintaining a large army on an island that had been stripped bare, dependent on supply lines, across a sea that grew more dangerous by the day. The political dimensions of this decision complicated the military considerations. Returning to Tunis without Malta would be seen as a personal failure by Ibn Uthman, a stain on his reputation that might cost him the Sultan's favour and possibly his position or even his life. Commanders who failed sultans in the medieval Islamic world did not typically enjoy comfortable retirements. Yet continuing a siege with diminishing prospects of success, expending resources and lives to no purpose, represented an even greater failure, particularly if the operation ended in disaster through disease or storm or some other catastrophe. Inside Medina, the defenders faced the same kind of endgame calculations from their own perspective. The food situation had deteriorated beyond rationing into actual starvation. People were consuming things that would have been rejected as unfit in peacetime, and the daily death toll from hunger-related causes had begun to rival casualties from enemy action. The physical condition of the defenders, even though still nominally fit for duty, had declined alarmingly as weeks of inadequate nutrition took their inevitable toll. Monroy could see in the hollow eyes and wasted frames of his soldiers that time was running out regardless of what the enemy did. If the siege continued much longer, the Hafsid forces would eventually assault walls defended by men too weak to effectively resist. Yet something had shifted in the dynamic of the siege during those last weeks of November, something that neither commander could quite quantify, but that both could sense in the rhythm of operations and in intelligence reports from spies and deserters. The Hafsid assaults came less frequently and with less conviction, as if the attackers were going through motions rather than seriously attempting to breach the defences. The bombardment continued but seemed almost perfunctory compared to the intensive barrages of earlier months. The besiegers' camp showed signs of deterioration in discipline and morale, with reports of increased disputes among the soldiers and growing reluctance to participate in assault operations. The final crisis of the siege came not from military action but from weather. In early December, a massive storm system swept across the Mediterranean, bringing with it winds and waves that devastated the Hafsid fleet anchored off Malta's coast. Ships dragged their anchors and smashed into each other or were driven onto rocks, and when the storm finally passed after 3 days of fury, Ibn Uthman discovered that he had lost more than 30 vessels, including several of his largest transports. The material cost was severe, but the psychological impact was even more devastating. The army on Malta suddenly felt cut off from North Africa, in a way that previous supply difficulties had not quite achieved, isolated on an island they could not conquer with an enemy that refused to surrender. Ibn Uthman held a council with his senior commanders on December 8th, a meeting that stretched through an entire night as officers debated whether to continue the siege or withdraw. The arguments for continuation emphasized the dishonor of retreat and the resources already expended, suggesting that one more major assault might succeed where previous attacks had failed. The arguments for withdrawal focused on the deteriorating supply situation, the approach of winter, and the uncomfortable reality that the defenders had proven far more resilient than anyone had predicted. When dawn broke on December 9th, Ibn Uthman announced his decision. The army would withdraw to North Africa, abandoning the siege and conceding that Malta would remain in Christian hands. The evacuation of 18,000 men, or rather the approximately 16,000 who survived to this point, across storm-prone December seas represented a logistical and organisational challenge comparable to the original invasion. Ibn Uthman, whatever his failings as a besieger, proved himself a competent administrator in managing this dangerous operation. He organised the withdrawal in carefully planned stages, maintaining defensive positions around Medina to prevent any interference from the defenders, while systematically moving units to the embarkation points and loading them onto the remaining ships. The Maltese defenders, watching this withdrawal from their walls, could scarcely believe what they were witnessing. The massive army that had surrounded them for 4 months was simply leaving, packing up its camps and siege engines and marching toward the coast without any final climactic assault or negotiated settlement. Monroy, cautious and experienced, forbade any sally to harass the withdrawing forces, recognizing that his half-starved soldiers were in no condition to challenge even a retreating professional army, and that victory was assured if he simply allowed the enemy to depart unmolested. The last Hafsid soldiers departed Malta on December 18th, 1429, exactly 4 months after the siege had begun. The invasion that was supposed to establish North African control over a strategic Mediterranean island had instead demonstrated the limits of military power when confronted with determined resistance and the vicissitudes of weather and logistics. Ibn Uthman returned to Tunis to face the Sultan's wrath, though he apparently retained enough political support to avoid execution, instead being reassigned to less prestigious commands away from the Mediterranean theatre. For Malta, the immediate aftermath of the siege brought challenges almost as severe as the siege itself. The island's agriculture had been devastated by the Hafsid occupation, with fields trampled, orchards destroyed, livestock slaughtered or driven off, and irrigation systems damaged. The population within Medina was in no condition to immediately undertake reconstruction, with widespread starvation and disease claiming lives even after the enemy departed. Relief supplies from Sicily arrived slowly, delayed by winter weather and the Sicilian authorities' characteristic inefficiency, meaning that the suffering of the Maltese population continued for months after their military victory. Yet the siege established something that would resonate through Maltese history for centuries afterward, a sense of collective identity forged in shared hardship and unlikely triumph. The 800 defenders who had stood against 18,000 invaders became the founding myth of Maltese nationalism, proof that the island's people could defend their homeland against overwhelming odds when survival demanded it. The fact that most of these defenders were not professional soldiers, but rather ordinary farmers and craftsmen made the story even more powerful, suggesting that courage and determination could overcome apparent military impossibility. The broader strategic consequences of the failed siege rippled across the Mediterranean world in ways that contemporaries recognized as significant, even if they could not fully predict the long-term implications. The Hafsid Sultanate's reputation suffered considerably from the failure to conquer a small island defended by a tiny force, and the dynasty never again attempted an operation of comparable scale against Christian territories. The Kingdom of Aragon, which had provided minimal assistance during the siege itself, nonetheless claimed credit for the victory and used it to enhance its prestige as a defender of Christendom against Muslim expansion. Military theorists in both Christian and Islamic worlds studied the siege for lessons about the evolving nature of warfare in an age when gunpowder weapons were beginning to transform battlefield dynamics. The fact that Medina's medieval fortifications had ultimately withstood a siege by an army equipped with cannon suggested that the defensive advantages still lay with fortified positions, though the extensive damage that artillery had inflicted pointed toward a future where traditional castle walls would prove increasingly vulnerable. The siege contributed to accelerating developments in fortification design, particularly the evolution toward lower, thicker walls better able to resist cannon fire, changes that would culminate in the trace Italian fortification style of the following century. The individual fates of the siege's participants varied widely in the years that followed. Monroy received recognition and promotion from the King of Aragon. Though he died just 3 years later during a naval expedition against North African pirates, his body never recovered from the Mediterranean that had defined so much of his military career. Many of the defenders who survived the siege lived out their lives as farmers and craftsmen, their moment of military glory becoming a story they told to grandchildren, who listened with varying degrees of interest or skepticism. Some few parlayed their siege experience into military careers, becoming professional soldiers or militia officers, their service at Malta serving as credential and recommendation. The physical scars of the siege remained visible on Malta for decades afterward. The breaches in Medina's walls were repaired slowly and imperfectly, with obvious patches where new masonry filled gaps created by Hafsid bombardment. The countryside took years to recover from the devastation of having two armies, one besieging and one besieged, drawing upon its limited resources, Trees that were cut down for siege engines or firewood required decades to regrow, and some agricultural land that was damaged during the fighting never fully recovered its productivity. The Siege of Malta in 1429 represents one of those historical events that seems almost too unlikely to be true, where the actual outcome contradicts every reasonable expectation based on comparative force strengths and conventional military wisdom. 800 defenders, most of them lacking military training or experience, successfully resisted 18,000 professional soldiers for 4 months before the besiegers gave up and withdrew. The victory owed much to specific circumstances. The strength of Medina's fortifications, the difficulty of maintaining a large army on a small island, favourable weather at crucial moments, and the defenders' desperate determination born of knowing that surrender meant enslavement or death. Yet circumstantial advantages alone cannot fully explain the outcome. The defenders fought with skill and courage that transcended their lack of formal military training, developing tactics suited to their particular situation, and maintaining cohesion under conditions that might have caused more professional forces to collapse. Monroy's leadership proved crucial, but so did the collective resolve of ordinary people who discovered within themselves capabilities they had not known existed until survival demanded their emergence.